My first item here is to introduce Shawn, and people sometimes sort of reel away those biographies, but I'll start with this. There's this saying, which you use in different situations, where you say, "Tell me something," and depending on the situation, you kind of fill in. Tell me what color of a toilet paper you use or what books you like, and I'll tell you who you are. That saying goes. So I could sort of adapt that and say, "Tell me if you know who Shawnem Martinbrough is, and I'll tell you whether you know anything about comics." Because if you don't know who he is, then you don't know, well, much about comics. But of course, not that we would hold that against you. So let me maybe, just for those who may not recognize the name and may not recognize his work, although I suspect you have seen his work around. Shawnem Martinbrough is an American comic book artist based, as Elizabeth said, in Washington, D.C. His probably most high profile and one of the longest projects that he has worked on is Robert Kirkman's Thief of Thieves. Robert Kirkman, of course, is the guy primarily known for the Walking Dead franchise, really, by that point. And Thief of Thieves is exactly what it seems to be about if you look at the title. And you could probably say that if you look at kind of a bird's eye view at Shawn's work, that a lot of his projects, a lot of his corporations revolve around sort of crime and heist and detective and, that sort of ballpark kind of comics, which is not a coincidence because he is really recognized as an artist, as someone who has perfected and developed what you could call noir visual style, or neo-noir, or whatever comes or passes for noir in comics. And for a reason, because among his other work, there is a book titled How to Draw Noir Comics, The Art and Technique of Visual Storytelling, that came out on Penguin. Was it Penguin? It was Penguin, right?
Yeah, I think it was, well, actually it was Watson Guptill, but then like many publishers, they got absorbed by
Penguin. That has been really a bestseller since almost, well, it's like 15 years almost. It came out in 2007. So it's been a long time. When it comes to comics, and of course, How to Draw Noir Comics is a sort of a really beautiful resource for people interested in the technique, but also in how to get into comics or specific genres of comics. But when it comes to comics, Shawn began his career as an inker. That's one of the functions in the comics industry. Inker for Milestone Media and Milestone Comics. For those who don't know, Milestone Media was this revolutionary outfit founded by a coalition of African-American artists and writers back in 1993. And it has been, in retrospect, incredibly influential in sort of breaking up that previously sort of very wide veneer of a comic books industry. Later on, among the titles, and I'm just going to be mentioning a few, Shawn has worked on The Creeper in 97 and 98. He collaborated on one of the shorter lines of Morlocks in 2002. He worked on Angel Town in 2005, which is very heavily influenced by kind of a blaxploitation idiom and draws very heavily on the detective novels by Chester Himes and Walter Mosley. His other really high-profile projects include Batman, or one of the multiple or new, almost impossible to count lines of Batman comics, detective comics, DMZ, which is a cult science fiction dystopian line, Luke Cage Noir, of course, noir being Shawn's favorite aesthetic, Black Panther, Men Without Fear, and Hellboy, and of course, since 2012, Thief of Thieves. And on top of that, the characters that he co-created feature were or have been featured in films, Deadpool and Justice League, and several animated large-scale animated projects. So this is really a wonderful CV and a wonderful record, and of course he's just getting started. So I personally really look forward to his future projects. So now for today, I mean, just to bring everyone up to speed, Sean will begin with perhaps like a 10-15 minute introduction where he can say whatever he wants to say. And then I understand a number of people have sent in their questions. And Sean, I only have 37 on my short list. But of course, we will not have time to go through all of them, but I have sort of combined some of the questions overlapped, luckily. So I sort of combined them. I have 6 on my kind of a really short list. So hopefully we will have time to go through that. But first, let me give the floor and sort of invite everyone to welcome Shawnem Martinbrough. And we do the equivalent of clapping on muted microphones.
Okay. Okay, so thank you, Paul. Thank you so much for that great introduction. The check is in the mail.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I only do American currency, so no euros for you.
I have an account in dollars, so that's fine.
Okay, we take a post-dated, outdated check. So. Okay, but anyway, thank you everyone for having me. It's such a pleasure to talk to you, and this has been such a great honor working with the Polish embassy, and I really wish I could be there in person to talk to you, but unfortunately we are all locked down in home and hopefully staying safe. So as Paul mentioned, I am a professional artist. I have primarily been working in comics since the early 90s. I'm a native New Yorker, even though I live in Washington, D.C., this nice, very calm place of reason and thoughtfulness here. But I'm a native New Yorker, originally from the Bronx. And I grew up loving comics from a very early age. I used to read comics all the time. And I love the art, love the stories. One of the great things about comic books that always pulled me in was the stories would sort of take me to a different place, usually sometimes a different time, different types of people, which really just opened my eyes to the possibilities of people who were different than me, having experiences that were different than me, but there was something so relatable about them, which really pulled me in. And that made me want to tell my own stories. And so from an early age, I started copying what I would see in the comic books. So I would start sketching on pieces of paper, sketch pads. And then at one point, my mom and my dad said, hey, listen, you know, this kid might have a little something. So they enrolled me in a local painting class. It was a community center in the Bronx, and there was a painter who would teach painting, and I would see him maybe once or twice a week. And for an hour, we would just sit and paint. And that really kind of opened my eyes to color theory and constructing composition. And that really sent me on a path of becoming an artist. And then shortly after, and this is maybe when I was around in junior high, for you guys, junior high is somewhere around 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade here in the States. And then when I was ready to go to high school, my mom wanted me to go to a specialized school. Well, my mom and my dad. They both wanted me to go to a specialized school to focus on my art. And so I applied and got accepted into the Fiorello H. LaGuardia High School of Music and Art, which is the famed school where, if you think about that old classic American film, the kids would jump up on tables and start dancing in the middle of the day. And that was really true. Although I was an artist, so I couldn't sing, so I could just sit there and clap along and say that's really cool. But it was an amazing high school experience because everyone who went to the school, you had to have some kind of artistic talent. So the school was comprised of artists, music majors, vocal majors, drama majors, and dance majors. And to be under one roof with all of these creative types was amazing. It was also cool because as an art major, the artists and the dancers were, we were located on the same floor. So during the day, you would see girls walking around in leotards, which is pretty cool. And all the other classes would, all the other majors would try to come up to our floor and hang out. So, but that was a really great time because you were in such a cipher of creativity. And at the time, I kind of felt that art was a bit boring, because when you're going to school with kids that can sing and dance and play instruments, art just seems so static and kind of like, gee, all right. I mean, it's not as energetic. But then as I got older and I started developing my craft, I was like, wait a minute, art is actually the most pervasive art form out there, because everything is affected by art. The tablet that we're looking at now is designed by artists. Our homes are designed by architects. You walk down the street, a street sign is designed by a graphic designer. You know, the packaging on your food is designed by a graphic designer. And that just really showed me how powerful the impact of images are, and how images can really just inspire people, not only, you know, on your block, but around the world. Art and images travel, and they can affect how people think and how they see things. And it also inspires art. And that's, I love the saying, art inspires art. So going through high school, I really started, you know, focusing on my art, and I began meeting professional comic book artists, which was amazing, because a lot of times as artists, we get the stigma of, oh, you're an artist, so you must be broke and starving and have no money. And sometimes that does happen. But there are plenty of artists that are thriving, that are making fantastic living. Like, that was really inspiring to meet professional artists that were drawing comics that were doing really well. And it also showed me that I could do it. And once again, interacting with other people, it just inspires you, and it motivates you. And so after I graduated from music and art, I went to the School of Visual Arts, which is also in Manhattan, New York City. And I became I majored in illustration. And while I was in college, I really was determined not to wait until I graduated college to look for a job, because why wait to look for a job when everyone else is looking for a job that's graduating? So in my junior year, I planned to try to get professional work. And at the time, this is back in like 1992. Back in 1992 in the States, and you know, there was only one comic convention. Now you have comic conventions all around the world, and the San Diego Comic-Con is like the biggest convention in the States. But back then, there was no Comic-Con. The only comic convention was the New York Comic-Con. And that's where big publishers like Marvel and DC would send their editors to scout for talent. So if you wanted to get into comics, you would, and this is pre-internet, if you can even imagine, there was none of this, no Zoom, no cell phones, no nothing. What you had to do was make photocopies of your work, put it into a leather portfolio, and you would go to this convention, stand online, and hopefully wait to see an editor. And once you got to the editor, they would look at your portfolio and go through your work and say, okay, you need to fix this. This is good. This is bad. And if they liked it, at the end, they would give you their card and say, give me a call. And fortunately, I waited online and I met an editor named Marcus McLaurin. He worked for Marvel. He went through my portfolio, and at the end, he gave me a card and said to give me a call. And I said, he was the editor of their Epic line, which was their sort of more sophisticated line. It didn't deal with the superheroes, but at the time they had the Hellraiser license. So they were producing Hellraiser comic books. And so I gave him a call, went in to meet with him. I got dressed up in a suit. The Marvel offices at the time were on 28th Street and Park Avenue. So I was all excited, really nervous, you know, put on my suit, went to the office, and everyone in the office was casual. You know, I was the only one there in a suit. But you can never be too dressy for a situation. So I always remember that. But I sat down, met with him, and he gave me my first professional job, which was a fully painted illustration for their Hellraiser graphic novel that they were putting out every month. And that was my first professional work in 1992. And from there, you know, I started doing more painted work for Marvel. And then, as Powell said, I started inking for Milestone because I knew the Milestone guys. Milestone was a really great company. They really pushed a diverse line of characters. Probably one of the first publishers to come out with LGBTQ characters. It was a great company, but I knew them. I knew the people that had formed it. So I would go there and hang out in between classes at the School of Visual Arts and working for Marvel. And then one day they said, hey, listen, would you want to ink one of our main titles? And it was called Static. And you guys, when you are a freelance artist, it's always good. You'll notice that when you work for one particular company, the other companies will want to work they'll want to steal you and get you to work for them. I started working for Milestone, then I started working for DC Comics. DC Comics, I started working for, as Pablo said, I started doing work on the Creeper. I started working on, and then I started working on Batman, which was amazing. I became the first regular artist the regular Black artist to work on Batman, which was Detective Comics, which was great. I worked with the great writer Greg Rucka, and we worked together for 2 years on that. And then over the years, I just started bouncing back and forth between different companies. And so I would do work for Marvel, then do work for DC. I drew Luke Cage Noir for Marvel, worked on the Black Panther, went back to DC, worked on DMZ, and then I got approached. Oh, I also did my art instruction book, How to Draw Noir Comics, which was a great resource to let people know about my approach to storytelling, because storytelling is pretty much the basis for, I think, art. You know, either whether you tell a story in a single image or multiple panels in the graphic novel format. And then after I did that book, I got an email from Robert Kirkman, who is the co-creator of The Walking Dead. And he said, listen, Sean, I'm a big fan. I'd love to work with you on something that's not zombie related, but this is all about thieves that go around and sort of steal things around the world. It's like kind of like a James Bond thing. And I said, sure. And that was great. And we worked together for close to about 6 or 7 years. I drew 44 issues of the title. And then I started working with Comixology. They put out a digital comic book called Prométhée 1313, which is based on a very popular series of graphic novels from France called Prométhée. And I did that. And now I'm currently working on my own original graphic novel called The Head-Ins for Abrams Books that I'm writing and illustrating. And you can see some of the work behind me. Hopefully you can't see it too close because it hasn't come out yet. But it's very exciting because this is me telling my own story with my own original characters, and it's my own voice. And it's going to be all in black and white. It's going to be 155 pages, and I'm very excited about it. And then I also started, as I said, with that project, I began writing. So I started transitioning from telling stories just simply as an artist to telling stories as a writer. And then I wrote a 2-issue story for DC Comics of the Red Hood, which was a really fun exercise. It really introduced me to people as a writer. So I basically bounced back and forth between different projects. I was invited to work on an amazing project for Vanity Fair. They were doing a very special Black Lives Matter themed issue in September, and it was guest edited by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is the very celebrated, well-known author. And he was doing an entire magazine about the subject, invited me to do it. So I did like 2 illustrations for them, which was really amazing. And that's the great thing about being an artist, is that you get to work with different types of people and you get to tell stories in different types of formats. And so it's amazing to sort of go from drawing a graphic novel in sequential panels to doing something for a commercial client like Vanity Fair and doing something in a single image. And you sort of have to flip a switch in your brain to go from telling a story from panel to panel to one image, but it's a fun exercise and it's great. And once you start building relationships with different types of clients in different types of mediums and genres and industries, it's great, because then people, if you do a good job and if you do it on time, they'll want to hire you again. And that's the name of the game of being an artist, because you kind of have to wear 2 hats as a freelance artist. You have to have your creative side, which is always pushing to do better, to get better, to explore different sides of your creativity. But then you also have to be business minded and think about, okay, I have to work with clients, I have to be professional, I have to be on time. And those are 2 things that, you know, you must balance as an artist. I know that when I went to school, they really didn't teach me too much about the business side of being an artist. They tend to focus on, you know, knowing your craft, the foundation of drawing, perspective, seeing different art forms. But I know that, you know, as a freelance artist, you constantly have to keep yourself busy, because we have this weird thing called rent and bills that need to be paid. So you constantly have to keep busy, and that's very important. So I think my journey, starting from comic books and also a love of movies, it really just it just opened my eyes to storytelling, and also wanting to transport people to different places and see different things and different types of characters that have different perspectives and different backgrounds. And for me, that makes me a better artist, because I think the more well-rounded you are to sort of noticing and appreciating the differences in the world around you, the better creator you will be. Like, so for example, I always have movies and TV shows on when I'm drawing. Usually there's shows that I've seen a million times. I can watch my favorite TV shows over and over, like people will listen to like their favorite song like 10 times in a row. I can watch the same show and movie over and over again. And so recently I did a marathon of Indiana Jones, which I love those movies. Those are classics. And I put on Indiana Jones, The Temple of Doom, and the opening of that scene. And, you know, I'm assuming that some of you guys might've seen Indiana Jones, The Temple of Doom. The way that movie opens is with this big dance number. It's a song and dance number where the lead character is singing Anything Goes, but she's singing it in Mandarin. And I never forgot that song, because Anything Goes was an American song. I think it was Gershwin that might've wrote it. But for Indiana Jones, The Temple of Doom, the opening of the movie takes place in Shanghai. So the lead character was singing it in Mandarin. And I never forgot, and I don't speak Mandarin, but just hearing her sing this song in this different language, it always stuck with me. And it always just sort of, you know, I just find it so fascinating just hearing her speaking that in Mandarin. And that's just, to me, it's a perfect example of being exposed to something completely different, but being inspired by it. And so I always encourage artists, especially aspiring artists, to sort of go outside your bubble, go outside your neighborhood, go to a museum when things open back up, and just explore the differences of the world around you, because it'll make you a better creator. It'll make you a better artist. It'll make you a better writer. And let's say you can't go that far. Even if you were to like stick around, even like, let's say you would take a little journey around your neighborhood, walk 3 blocks. If you really focus, you'll see differences between how each house might be decorated, how each lawn might be decorated, each car might be, you know, each car is different. And even if people look like you, chances are they probably are different in terms of like what they're into, or how they dress, or how they talk, or how they carry themselves. And I think that's the fascinating thing. And that was the great thing that I can always think about going to music and art high school, where you had so many different kids that were all, you know, either, like I said, art majors, music majors, dance majors, vocals majors. They all came from different places in New York City. So they were bringing all of their different collective experiences under one roof. And you can kind of be inspired by differences around you. And for me, that's what the power of art is, because you can translate this into your medium and just inspire people and just open people's eyes to something different. And I'm always looking to experience something new. You know, I'm a big sci-fi buff, and one of the things I always pull from my like Star Trek is there was a character in the first movie, and the big bad guy, he had like, well, it was a satellite from and I'm getting really kind of nerdy, geeky with you guys here, but there's a saying from that first Star Trek movie where there's a character, his mission statement was learn all that is learnable, because he was a computer. So he was kind of sent into space, and the mission was to learn all is learnable. And to me, I've always used that as a basic tenet for how I go through life. If I don't know anything about something, I am going to ask you a zillion questions about it, whether you're a CEO of a Fortune 500 company or a garbage man, because I'm not a garbage person. So I don't know the techniques of picking up garbage. You know what I mean? Even like your maintenance person in your building, there's an art, there's a technique to mopping floors or cleaning things. You know what I mean? So you can always learn something from everyone. And so being a creative person is sort of opening your eyes, opening your ears, and most importantly, opening up your mind and taking in everything, every facet, every detail, every piece of information that you can add to your collective knowledge. That's what you should do. So that's pretty much my sort of mentality going out there. And that's pretty much what life is. Life is a learning lesson. You know, you never stop learning until you die. You know, anybody who says, I know it all, they don't know anything, because you'll realize the more you grow, the less you know. This world is huge. You know what I mean? Like, I know very little about Poland, you know? And so I was very excited to go to Poland to visit, so I can just add my knowledge of Poland to my consciousness. And so, you know, and listen, I mean, I'm sure that you guys that live in Poland, you might think, yeah, I know Poland, but you probably don't. If you really go to, have you been to every neighborhood in Poland, every region of Poland? Have you been everywhere? You know, and that's what it's all about. So learn all that's learnable and just constantly be on a quest to sort of add information, because it'll make you a better creator, whether you're an artist, a graphic designer, painter, cartoonist. I mean, I'm always looking at other people to see how they solve problems with regard to artists. You know, and there's so many amazing artists out here that, you know, for me, my goal as an artist is just to get better, you know, to better my craft. And trust me, I share the same kind of insecurities that you all do, where you're like, oh, am I good enough? And oh, this isn't great. Every artist feels this way. Every artist is like, oh my God, you know, like that's not what I wanted to do. Because to me, the greatest challenge is trying to translate what's in your head to put it on paper. And most times you can never get it. I'll be happy if I get maybe 80% there, 75%, but that's the challenge, is to sort of take your idea and put it down on paper. And so I encourage everyone to, you know, constantly draw, because that's how you get better. Constantly write, constantly practice designing, fill your sketch books up with, you know, as much of your ideas as possible, and also date it. Because when you get old like me, you're going to look back and say, oh, wow, I did that when I was back in 2021. So, yeah. So that's pretty much a brief history of my background in comics and art. And I am, like I said, I'm very pleased to speak with you all. And so please ask away for questions. I see we only have 54 questions here, so let's go.
Yeah, well, but you've just, you actually, in your introduction, you've just taken care of at least 15. So there. But since we are talking about it, so this is very, very inspiring, especially since a number of the questions that we received concerned, you know, sort of getting started or sort of inspiration. So I'm sure this is very valuable for a number of people here. I was wondering, since one of the things that is very clear from your career and from what you've been talking about is that you work on a lot of projects, very different projects, but at the same time, of course, you are not exclusively, of course, but you are centrally associated with a noir aesthetic. And of course, you have written a book about that. So I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about how you got into that, how this became at least one of your signature styles, and what precisely has attracted to you to that particular aesthetic.
Sure. Well, there's so many different great art styles out there. I know that when I was in high school, and this is when you're in school, especially if you go to an art school, they will send you to museums on field trips. They'll tell you to read art books that are usually filled up with old artists that you're like, why do I care about old artists? But it's interesting to see how these artists would tell a story. They're different styles. I love the Impressionist period. That's probably one of my favorite styles of painting. And for those that you don't know, Impressionism is sort of, if you're doing a painting of a landscape, you're not going to draw every single tree, every single detail, but you'll kind of use brush strokes that kind of give you the sense of what it is. So it's almost like a very loose way of creating an image. And I always gravitated to that. Now, since I was a big comic book fan, I started seeing different styles of the comic book artists. And there were some artists that were very detailed. There were some artists that were very realistic in how they would draw characters. And then others that were more abstract, more simple, more cartoony. But I started looking at artists who started using a lot of shadows, a lot of black, heavy black areas in their work. And the artists that stuck out to me were artists like Frank Miller, Alex Toth, David Mazzucchelli, Mike Mignola. And I always thought it was really striking to use shadows, you know, in your work. It sort of added like this extra layer of drama to each panel. And so I started emulating that. I started looking at that. And also I started kind of fusing that with Impressionism, where if you put something in shadow, you're eliminating the detail. But I find that when the human brain looks at an image, they like to sort of be challenged, if this makes sense. So for example, I think that when you're reading a comic book and there's something knocked into shadow, or if there's a figure that might not be completely drawn, but it's maybe just drawn as a gesture, your brain will fill in the gaps that aren't there. And I think that's something that kind of adds to a more satisfying experience for your eye. And it's a subconscious thing, you know, and it also separates, it creates depth within the frame to have something that's completely in shadow, and then to use very simple contour lines for something in the background, because as things recede, they get less detail. And that's something that I was taught, you know, in art class and in painting class. So playing with light and dark, thin lines versus thick lines was always something that I would think about when I would draw images. And I think that was very apparent in looking at artists that used a lot of shadows, which, you know, they would call noir. And then when people would see my work, they'd say, oh, you have a very noir style. And I'm like, oh, really? Okay. And then I learned what noir means, and noir is the French word for black. And noir is usually described as like it's usually used as a word to describe a mood. So for a lot of black and white old films, they'll describe them as a film noir because they're very dramatic. There's a lot of harsh, dark and light, a lot of contrast. And so a lot of people have described my style to be in a noir type of style. So I'm like, okay, cool.
Yeah, it works for you. Would you say that drawing and creating black and white comics is easier than doing like a full-blown palette color ones? Because that could be a sort of common assumption that, or is it equally difficult, or maybe even more challenging in some ways?
Well, it's weird for me because I started out doing fully painted work for Marvel. So I was working as a painter. But then once I started getting into inking and then started drawing my own stuff, now I just see things in black and white. So it's very weird. I can't color my own work. So I always work with a colorist. And usually comic books are broken up into a team of people that work to produce one comic book. Some comic books are done by one artist. Those are usually children's books that might be done by one particular artist. But in the comic book industry, you have a team, and usually you have someone who writes the script, someone who pencils it, which means they draw everything out in pencil. Then you have an inker who goes over their pencil line and they create depth with using different types of lines and shadows. Then you have a colorist, then you have a letterer. So for me, like whenever I draw a comic book, I only see it in black and white. So I have to work with a colorist. And I can give the colorist notes because I understand color theory. I just see my own work in black and white. And it's still to this day, like I just did a spread for Vanity Fair, and I worked with a friend of mine, Christopher Sotomayor, who is an amazing colorist. And so I gave him the black and white line art, and then he colored it. And then there were 3 pieces for this Vanity Fair spread. And there was one piece that we just couldn't, there was something missing. When he sent me his color file, I said, yeah, this is good. We're almost there. I can't quite put my finger on it. And so we were going back and forth in email, and finally I just called him up, and we were just sort of chit-chatting while he was making tweaks in color. And I was like, okay, how about if we adjust the color here, we just adjust the value there. And then we got to the point of it being finished, and that was great. So for me, I primarily see things in black and white, but I understand color. So I can sort of give notes, but for my own work, I can only see it in black and white. And fortunately for this project behind me that I'm working on for Abrams Books, it's all black and white. So, you know, so for me, like I'm separating things out with line, you know, so that's how I just see things now.
So that's the one that you're writing too, right? Yeah. Like a one-man show. One of the questions, you know, since we are talking about the sort of more technical aspects of making comics, and you know, actually, I think it's a very good question. Is it goes, what is the most difficult page or scene you've ever drawn? And I know, you know, it's hard to pick like the one most difficult, but can you remember any that, you know, I know you struggled for a long time, and why was it so difficult?
Well, here's the thing. Every day there's a new challenge. Like the scariest thing you can ever look at least for me, is a blank page, because it's like, okay, I always think to myself, I don't know how I'm going to get out of this one, you know, and then you just have to start. And sometimes some of the most difficult scenes that I'm dreading will be the easiest. And sometimes the most simplest drawing will take me the longest, which is so frustrating. So for example, in this graphic novel that I'm writing and drawing, there's this big meeting with all of these gangsters. And this is going to require at least 30 different characters in one scene. And I was always dreading this because I would have to come up with specific looks for each of the characters. You know, they have different, each one has a different age. They have a different style of suit. It's literally like right out of The Godfather, where they're sitting down and having this big meeting. And I was always dreading this. But what I did was I just started it. And then once you just sort of start, you get into a groove. And I'm actually almost done. Actually, no, I am done with the scene. I just finished it the other day. And I'm moving on to another scene. And I was like, that wasn't that bad. You know, but then there'll be a simple scene where there's a character like scratching their chin, and that'll take me forever. So you just never know. Sometimes, you know, the artistic process, it just clicks. And then other times it just takes you forever to sort of nail something. And a lot of times I don't like it when my drawing becomes overworked, which means you keep going over and over the same image because it drains all the life out of it. And sometimes I just have to stop and I'll just go on to like a different panel and then I'll come back to that. And so it's a process. You know, sometimes the easiest things will be like the pieces, the drawing that you think will be the easiest is the hardest, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. And you know, since you mentioned that, how long does it? And I know that may differ between projects, but how long does it take you to do either a panel or a page? Are we talking hours or days? Especially when you have at least some sort of general idea where you're going to go.
Well, let me see. If my bosses are listening, then I can do a page very fast. But sometimes it'll take like maybe like a day or two for a page. Like these pages, I've been going at a very nice leisurely pace. So maybe like a day or two to do an entire page. But sometimes you're at the mercy of your deadline. So for example, the Vanity Fair spread, they needed that turned around very fast. So I literally had to do that in a weekend. I had to do three different illustrations in a weekend. So you don't really have the time to sort of, you know, take your time. And that's what's going to happen. That's what you're going to encounter as a freelance artist. You are at the mercy of the deadline. And that's, you know, and sometimes you can work on something for days, months, years, or whatever, but you just don't have that kind of luxury unless you have that kind of power as an artist to say, I'll give it in what I want. Usually if someone hires you, if they hire you on a Monday, they say, we need it by Wednesday, and you just have to give it up to hit that deadline. And, you know, so yeah, you're at the mercy.
So is that how soon they usually want it? So is that turnover in the comics industry really so ruthless? Well, because it is pretty ruthless.
Well, here's to me, the tightest deadline would be commercial illustration. So if you get hired to do a storyboard or a graphic design piece or a commercial illustration or an editorial illustration for like a magazine, those are very quick turnarounds. And when I say quick, usually they want them within a week. Sometimes it could be like a couple of days. Comic books, they will give you maybe about a month to draw 20 or 22 pages. Sometimes it might be a little shorter, like 3 weeks, but a comfortable deadline would be to give an artist 5 weeks to draw 22 pages. Now, if you do book publishing, or if you work for like a European publisher, like, you know, those graphic novels, they give those artists a long time. They'll give them like maybe like a year or a year and a half to draw 150 pages, you know. So book publishing tends to be like a lot of time. Comic book, not so much. Commercial, editorial, storyboards, you know, the editorial illustration, really tight windows. So they like artists that can turn around and work very fast. Yeah.
There are actually two questions in the chat that are related to what we've been talking about, and maybe I'll just try to compress both of them into one. So one of these is the person who sketches comics getting ideas for sketches on their own, or do they get them from, for instance, from the writer? Or in other words, to what extent does this sort of directorial supervision exist?
Okay, so the way comic books are usually made, so let's take Marvel and DC. You have an editor who will say, hey, we have a Superman story. They'll hire a writer to write the story. The writer will write up a script, which pretty much looks like a movie or a television script. And they'll write 22 pages. Then they'll give that to the artist. The artist will look at that script, read the script, and then figure out how to tell the story. Now the script, the writer might give specific instructions, like they'll say, panel 1, Sean gets dressed. Panel 2, Sean logs onto the Zoom. Panel 3, Sean's talking to a bunch of people on the Zoom. Panel 4, Professor Powell asks him a question. And so I will follow that and decide on the different angles that I think will best tell that story. And that's up to me as the artist to visualize it. So I'm following the guidance from the script. So that's pretty much what you do. If you're hired to do a children's book, for example, if you are the one writing and drawing it, well, you write it out and then you're following your own script. And that's pretty much what I'm doing with this graphic novel here, where I wrote the manuscript last year. The manuscript was 150 pages, 155 pages. Once it was approved, now I'm drawing my own words. But you are usually always following a script. If you, like, for example, when I did the spread for Vanity Fair, they gave me the article that I had to read the article first and then figure out what images would be good to accompany that article. So if you ever pick up a magazine and you're reading an article and there's some artwork with it, that's pretty much what I just did there. So I had to read that article and say, okay, I think this would be a great visual to go along with that based on reading it. And then I submitted it, I sent it into my editor, he got approval, and then I got the green light and I can illustrate it. So you're usually following the words as an artist. You're usually trying to visualize words in some kind of way.
Mm-hmm. All right, so for a slight change of pace, one of the questions that came in through email before our session was, and it's kind of a long question, I'm going to read it out. The reimagining of classic characters such as Miles Morales, Riri Williams, Tim Drake, and so on, and introduction of new characters has been great for diversity, for representation in comics, right? And this person added that I wish Miles was around when I was growing up. But the question goes, however, when does it become more about sales for publishers than actual diversity, or whether it makes any difference if you have a diversity and representation in comics, which of course historically, had periods when they left a lot to be desired in terms of sort of diversity. So does it matter if the end result is representation, or can it become, or does it become ever sort of mere jumping the bandwagon because this is something that publishers are expected to do?
Well, here's something that people need to not forget, or they need to become aware of. This is a business. People print comic books because they want you to buy them so they can make money, so they can pay for their houses and their rent and their mortgages. So the more people you can get to buy comics, that's what they want. Now, for a long time, comics were edited, and actually they mostly still are, by white men. And a lot of these editors would see things through the viewpoint of a white male. So they wouldn't think about a female character, because all of their friends, everyone who worked in that editorial office was a white man. So all the people that were making decisions were white men, and that's how they were thinking. And so they wouldn't consider a female superhero because that's not what they were used to. So, but then when they realized, oh, wait a minute, women are reading comics, women would buy comics, and we want women's money, let's create some female characters. When they decided, hey, wait a minute, Black people, Hispanic people, Asian people, they read comics. And if we gave them a character that looked like them, they might spend the money. So let's do that. And so they're playing catch up now. So for example, for a long time, people said, oh, Black superheroes won't sell. They won't sell overseas. And then Black characters in movies don't sell. And then the Black Panther came out and made $1 billion. And now everyone's like, hey, we want to make $1 billion too. Where are our Black characters? Where are those Black characters? We want them now. So listen, I mean, for me, like Miles Morales was great, and it's taken the industry a long time to sort of expand their thinking. And there's a big debate within comics, which where they change the identity of a character that was probably a white male to either a female or a person of color. And they're like, oh, well, why don't they just create new characters? Okay. Well, once again, you have to look at it through a business lens. Which is riskier, to make Spider-Man a Black character or create a completely new character that no one knows and hope that they spend money on that? Well, the less risky your proposition is to make Spider-Man a Black character. And within comics, if you've been reading comics for any amount of time, comics have always changed the person who's sort of like, who's the character. So for example, like there have been different people that have been, that have held the hammer of Thor. So Thor lost his hammer for a good number of issues back in like I think the 80s, the 90s. And there was an alien that was running around with the Thor hammer. He basically beat up Thor, took his hammer and said, listen, I got a problem in my own universe and I need some backup. So I need your hammer right now. And he came and beat up Thor, took the Thor hammer, left Thor powerless. And that character's name was Beta Ray Bill. It was a great story. It was amazing. It was like, oh, that was so awesome. You've had different characters sort of pick up the mantle of these main characters. So that's not something new. But for me, I think that it could be interesting to create a balance where you might change the identity of a legacy character in addition to creating new characters. But once again, companies don't want to risk things, because if you risk something and no one buys it, then you might lose your job. And that's why people say, hey, how come Hollywood keeps remaking things? Why can't they just create something new? Well, think about it like this. If you work in Hollywood and you're making a nice salary, you have a nice parking space on the Hollywood lot, and you want to come up with something brand new and it tanks, there are 50 million people that are jumping at the chance to get your job. So you don't want to make any mistakes. So you'll say, well, let me remake Barbie, because we know Barbie sells. We know Barbie, people know Barbie the world around. There's less risk there. So at least someone's going to show up to see that Barbie movie. And that's why you get a Barbie movie versus something completely original. And that's the business aspect of it, which is reduce the risk. Now, on the flip side, you can have something completely original like The Matrix, which was groundbreaking. It totally affected, it was such an influential movie, but that was completely original. Now, those people that bet on that, they got away with it. But for every Matrix, there's some new movie that came out, it wasn't that good, it bombed, and people lost their jobs. So, right. So never always think about the business aspect of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but of course, regardless of that, comics have really improved over the last decade, 2 decades when it comes to representation. Do you feel that, especially if you look at those sort of really large scale comics, the Marvel, DC, sort of bigger independents, that is there any area where they still need to improve, or they have sort of stayed away? So of course, gender is better in comics, in mainstream comics. Race and ethnicity are better than they were. Is there any social dimensional space that they still need to work on, you feel?
I think in editorial, they need to diversify. They need to have women editors, more people of color that are editors, because they will be bringing in that perspective when they have their big meetings and say, okay, what kind of new books do we want to put out? Well, if they had a few women in the editorial board, they might have some interesting ideas for characters that might be female inspired, that might be female led. And having those different perspectives will only make your business that much more competitive. You know what I mean? So that to me is I think the biggest area of change that needs to happen,
Mm-hmm. Now, since we're talking about sort of, business, kind of an industry perspective, one of the very interesting questions, and perhaps by now kind of obvious for all of us, is about the ways in which the ongoing pandemic has changed or influenced, impacted the culture of comics, or the comics industry. So could you perhaps talk a little bit about that?
This is the weird thing. For when I talk to fellow comic book artists, be they writers, artists, letterers, colorists, this is pretty much our normal existence. We usually are stuck in the house working. So the fact that the world has come to a stop around us, that's the weird part. So usually for me, if I'm working on a deadline, I'll be stuck in the house for a couple of weeks. And then once I meet my deadline, I'll go out and I'll go travel, I'll go visit family and friends and go to restaurants. But the fact that I can't do that, that's the biggest change. I'm like, well, wait, I can't go anywhere now. So that's the biggest change. But this is the artist's life, being stuck in the house, being under quarantine. So you know, have a nice house, have a nice space that can inspire you when you're stuck inside having to draw something on a deadline, you know?
So you haven't experienced something like, for instance, fewer commissions or fewer projects coming your way?
Well, fortunately, like I'm fortunate to actually, I'm turning down work because, you know, I'm getting so many offers for work, and that's really great. The only thing that's different is that I'm really seeing I'm doing a lot more Zoom meetings. Everybody wants to do a Zoom meeting to talk about a project and this, that, or the other. Like that's the biggest change. What is interesting, and I was just talking about this with a friend, is that what the pandemic has done is it's accelerated the need, or it's accelerated companies allowing people to work from home. See, because back in the day, like, you know, people were just so used to having an office, having meetings and meetings and meetings and meetings and traveling. And now you realize, well, the companies realize, well, wait, we can save a lot of money by not paying for these office spaces. So a lot of the office spaces are going to pretty much go away. Like I was fortunate, like DC Comics, they had been based in Manhattan for the entirety of their existence. And about maybe 6 or 7 years ago, they moved to LA. And they have these really beautiful offices in Burbank, California. And I happened to be in LA a couple of years ago, and I went by and I saw that I got a tour for the first time. Beautiful office space. I'm so fortunate now that I did that, because they're not going back to those offices. Chances are, like, all of the editorial are working from home and they're having meetings like this. And I'm sure that Warner Brothers, which owns DC Comics, is saying, well, why are we spending all of this money on this expensive office space in Burbank? So I'm sure that those offices are done, and they're not alone. So that's the way a lot of companies are going to be functioning. That doesn't really affect me as an artist, but that's how the industry is being affected by the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we perhaps have time for two last questions, because we are sort of slowly trying
to. I'm here as long as, I'm here for you, Poland, so I will answer all questions.
Okay, but I have two. Okay. And actually, I'm sourcing those from chat. Some really good questions coming in there. So one of those is about the tools of your work. So we are back to making comics, and the extent to which you have or have not used graphic programs and digital tools rather than sort of hand-drawn, hand-painted stuff. So could you talk about this?
Well, I am still old school, so I still draw by hand. So my tools, I use a brush, I use a crow quill, and a little jar of ink. And so usually during the day, I wash my hands a million times because I usually have ink stained hands. So, so this whole pandemic thing of washing your hands, I'm used to that. But yes, I still work by hand. All of my artwork is done on original boards. I'm too lazy to learn how to draw on a computer, so I'm probably not going to do that ever. And also, there's something to consider, though, about working digitally versus working physically. A great revenue source for artists is selling original work. I don't sell any of my originals. I keep all of them. But if I wanted to, I could sell the original work. If you work digitally, you don't have that option. So, because people will pay less for a digital print than an original piece of artwork because there's only one piece. So but aside from all that, I'm just too lazy and I'm too old to learn how to draw on a computer. So I'm going to be drawing by hand.
But to what extent has the industry been switching to digital tools, or it hasn't really? So is it really individual? Comes down to individual artists?
Well, back in the day, probably around the beginning of the millennium, by hand. And so you would have, and so Marvel and DC, for example, they hire artists from around the world. So if I were living in Poland, I would draw out my page, put it in effect, and send it into DC Comics. I would send it via FedEx or whatever shipping service to the offices in DC. So they had packages coming from all around the world, which can get expensive. When the internet became a thing and people started sending files digitally, they got rid of all of that. So now what I do is, if I draw my work by hand, I'll scan it into Photoshop, create a digital file, and then I'll upload that to the company's server. And that's the way artwork is transferred around the world, like in every medium. You send a digital file. So that's the only part of the digital process that I'm a part of, which is I'll scan my work into Photoshop. I might do a tweak or two, and then I'll send the digital file off. But for the most part, I draw everything by hand. But companies, they only accept digital files from people.
Okay. So you do know how to use Photoshop after all.
Very basically, very basically.
Okay. All right. So one last question, and I assume none of the companies that have commissioned your work are listening in, because the question is, so which of your characters that you have worked on in the last 20 plus years, almost 30 years, is your favorite? See, we're not going to tell the others.
I can't, you know what? I get that question a lot. And honestly, I don't really have a favorite, because the way I approach each character is its own challenge. So when I was drawing Thief of Thieves, I was creating all of these original characters. When I was drawing Batman, that was really fun. And so they're their own experience. So I don't really say, I like this one better than that one. They're their own challenge. So yeah, I really just don't have one. Yeah.
That's a very political response.
but it's true. It's honest, you know.
No, I'm sure. Yeah. All right. I think that would be it from not so much me, but I mean, I have another 700 questions, but we could be here until Easter.
I am happy to answer as many questions as possible, so I'm going to blame it on you if you want to cut it off.
Should we do one more? Should we do one more, Pavel?
Sure. So let me just kind of look at the chat, you know, maybe the ones that are sort of coming in hot. Oh, that's an interesting one, because of course some of the work that you've done, the characters that you've worked with are parts of much larger franchises, and they have very long traditions going back, like Batman, for instance. So when you work with characters like that, to what extent do you consult or even sort of become familiarized with our past, or do you sort of decide, okay, I got commissioned to do that, and I have this vision of Batman or anyone else, and I'm not going to care about how they were presented in the past? Because of course, Batman has changed dramatically, right? For instance.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing, as if you're working on an established character. So for example, I just wrote a 2-part Red Hood story for DC Comics. There are parameters that I'm given when I write that story. You can't just change something major about an established character. So they basically told me, okay, well, you can do this, you can do that. I said, okay, well, can I use a particular Batman Rogues Gallery Vision character in the story? They said, okay, well, let's check to see what that character is doing. And it was funny because I wanted to use the Batman villain Clayface. And so my editor was like, well, let's see what Clayface is up to in continuity. And then they said, well, you can't use Clayface because he's on the straight and narrow these days. So you can't use him as the bad guy, which I thought was hilarious. So I said, okay, well, so then my editor suggested Killer Croc. I said, well, okay. They said, well, if you use Killer Croc is currently locked up in Arkham Asylum. So you have to get him out of Arkham Asylum to use him in your story. So those are the kind of things that when you're working on established characters, you have to see what those characters are doing and what you can and cannot do. When I was working as an artist on Detective Comics, you had to draw Batman a certain way. They gave you a guide. Actually, they gave every artist a visual guide of how Batman is to be drawn. And you had to draw him in that way. The only creative license you had was to maybe play with the length of his ears and the length of his cape. Everything else had to be exactly the way Batman looked at that time. So those are certain guidelines you have when you're working with established characters. When I was drawing Thief of Thieves, that was an original thing that I was doing with Robert Kirkman. So I could create everything. I just had to run it by him. And he was like, cool, you can do whatever you want. That was awesome. With my story that I'm doing for Abrams, this is all me. So it's whatever I want to do. And so that's the difference between working on something that's creator owned as in contrast to something that's part of an established, character in an established company.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Just as a little coda, someone asked, and may be very useful, could you mention the name of the art school you mentioned that you went to at the very beginning?
Okay, so I went to the Fiorello H. LaGuardia High School of Music and Art. I know it's a lot, but that's the name of the school. And actually the full name, because what they did was they had combined two schools. It is the Fiorello H. LaGuardia High School of Music and Art and Performing Arts. That's a lot.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, that was the high school. My university, my college was the School of Visual Arts.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. And I think that's it from us. Elizabeth.
And I will just say, if you don't mind, Pavel, you guys, thank you so much for your patience. I really apologize about all of that. And Sean, apologies to you. And Pavel, thank you for being our savior who knew exactly what to do. So thank you all so much. We hope you'll join us at our future events. And Sean, we hope to see you in the flesh in Poland after this whole thing is over.
I would love to. And everyone, thanks for tuning in. And please keep drawing, keep writing. And, you know, there are no mistakes. Mistakes are how you get better. So happy creating. And stay safe. Wash your hands.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Sean.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.